"I swear I'll be gentle," the giant cowboy promised the lonely black widow as dust swirled around her cabin and the town's watching eyes burned with judgment from across the valley. They called her cursed. 3 suitors dead, 2 years of whispered blame, a woman marked for slow starvation in a place that had already decided her fate. The widow mended clothes for coins, while neighbors crossed streets to avoid her shadow. But when the mountain of a man arrived seeking shelter for his horse, something shifted in the twilight air. He saw past the veil that shrouded more than grief. It hid the secret her dead husband left buried beneath their very feet, a discovery worth killing for, worth dying for. Now 2 souls carrying hidden truths must navigate a conspiracy that has already claimed lives. Will his promise of gentleness save them both, or destroy the last hope either has for redemption? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elmsworth's dusty Main Street as Eliza Montgomery hung wet laundry behind her weathered cabin. Her black dress moved like a specter against the brightening sky. From the general store porch, Rebecca Salter's voice carried sharp and clear. "That woman's touched by darkness. Mark my words." Eliza's hands stilled on the clothesline. 3 women gathered around Rebecca nodded in agreement. Their whispers had followed Eliza for 2 years now, ever since Thomas died in his sleep. The town had decided her fate long before she understood it herself. 3 men courted her. 3 men met bad ends. Rebecca's voice rose with each word. Coincidence don't stretch that far. The women scattered when Sheriff Clayton Archer approached on horseback. His weathered face remained neutral as he dismounted near Eliza's fence. She watched him from the corner of her eye while pinning Thomas's old shirt to the line. "Morning, Mrs. Montgomery." "Sheriff." She kept her voice steady. Archer studied her small garden, her patched roof, the careful way she moved. He said nothing about the rumors. He never did, but his presence reminded her that someone always watched. After he rode away, Eliza returned to her washing. The soap burned her cracked hands. She'd rationed her last bar for 3 weeks, shaving thin slivers into the wash water. Her stomach cramped from yesterday's meager dinner of cornbread and well water. The bank's brass bell chimed as Marcus Whitmore stepped onto the boardwalk. His polished boots clicked against the wood as he approached her gate. Eliza tensed. "Mrs. Montgomery." His smile never reached his eyes. "Still struggling with that old place, I see." She wrung out a worn sheet with steady hands. "I manage." "Do you?" Whitmore glanced at her patched dress, her thin frame. "My offer stands. Fair price for land that's brought you nothing but hardship." Fair price. Eliza knew better. Thomas had always said their plot held more value than Whitmore claimed. But Thomas was gone, and his dreams with him. "I'm not selling." Whitmore's smile faded. "Pride's a luxury you can't afford much longer." He tipped his hat and walked away. Eliza's hands shook as she hung the last piece of laundry. The wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the valley. That evening, she sat at Thomas's old desk, reviewing her accounts by candlelight. $3.47. Enough for a week of beans and flour if she stretched them. The ledger showed her dwindling income. Fewer customers each month. More whispered warnings to avoid the cursed widow. She touched Thomas's geology books stacked on the shelf. He'd been educated back east before coming to Elmsworth. A dreamer, people called him, always talking about mineral deposits and survey maps, always believing their small plot held hidden treasure. Nothing but rocks and dirt, she whispered to his photograph. But doubt gnawed at her. Thomas had been so certain, so excited in those final weeks before his death. He'd spent hours in the barn, studying papers and samples she'd never understood. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted her thoughts. Heavy footfalls approached her door. Eliza blew out the candle and peered through the window. A massive silhouette filled her vision. The man stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and patient. His horse stamped restlessly behind him. Most men would have pounded on the door by now. This one waited. Eliza cracked the door open. "Can I help you?" "Ma'am!" His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Name's Gideon Braxton. I'm looking for work and a place to stable my horse." Up close he seemed even larger, but his hands remained at his sides. His tone carried respect she hadn't heard in months. "I don't have work to offer. Perhaps you have barn space to rent?" Eliza studied his weathered face. Lines around his eyes suggested kindness, but she'd learned not to trust first impressions. Still, she needed the income desperately. "Where are you from?" "Been traveling. Heard this was a decent town." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Who told you that?" Gideon's expression shifted. Perhaps they were wrong. "Depends what you're looking for." Eliza opened the door wider. "You should know something before you decide to stay. This town believes I'm cursed. 3 men have shown interest in my company. All 3 met unfortunate ends." She expected him to back away. Instead, Gideon stepped closer. His presence blocked the wind that had been whipping around her doorframe. "I swear I'll be gentle," he said quietly. The words caught her off guard. Not promises of protection or dismissals of superstition, just gentleness. When had anyone offered her that? $2 a week for the barn, she heard herself say. Fair enough. As Gideon led his horse toward the weathered barn, Eliza watched from her doorway. Rebecca Salter's curtains twitched across the street. By morning, the whole town would know about the giant stranger staying at the cursed widow's place. She closed the door and leaned against it. $2 would buy her another week of survival. But survival meant nothing if the town's hatred finally boiled over. And something about Gideon's arrival felt different. Dangerous in ways she couldn't name. Outside, she heard him speaking softly to his horse, his voice carrying the same gentleness he'd promised her. Dawn broke gray and cold over Elmsworth. Eliza emerged from her cabin to find Gideon already at work repairing her barn door. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy, fitting new hinges with precision. "You don't need to do that." Hinges were hanging by rust. He didn't look up from his work. Storm would have torn this clean off. Eliza studied his methodical movements. Most men would have demanded breakfast or payment for extra work. Gideon simply fixed what needed fixing. From the main street came the familiar sound of Rebecca Salter's voice rising above the morning bustle. That giant's already under her spell. Mark my words, he'll be dead within the month. Gideon's hands stilled on the hinge. They always talk like that? Every day for 2 years. He resumed his work without comment. The barn door swung smooth and straight when he tested it. By afternoon, word had spread through Elmsworth like wildfire. The cursed widow had ensnared another victim. Customers who might have brought Eliza washing stayed away. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street rather than pass her gate. Eliza found Gideon in the barn, organizing the cluttered space where Thomas had stored his geological equipment. Wooden crates sat stacked against the far wall, covered in dust and forgotten dreams. "Careful with those," she said. "My husband's belongings." Gideon lifted a crate with gentle hands. He was a scholar? Thomas thought he was, always studying rocks and dirt samples. Her voice carried old pain. Said this land held secrets worth more than gold. What kind of secrets? Eliza shrugged. Dreams of a dead man. Nothing that pays for flour and beans. Together, they moved the crates to reach the collapsed shelf beneath. As Gideon lifted the heavy wooden beam, something scattered across the dirt floor. Not tools or household items, but papers. Maps covered in careful notations and technical drawings. Eliza knelt and gathered the scattered documents. Her breath caught. These weren't the amateur sketches she'd expected. The maps showed precise geological surveys, mineral density calculations, depth measurements. Professional work that required real education. These are survey maps, Gideon said quietly. You can read them? I worked railroad surveys for 5 years, before I started drifting. He knelt beside her, studying the detailed drawings. Your husband knew what he was doing. This is professional-grade geological work. Eliza's hands trembled as she recognized Thomas's careful handwriting along the margins. Technical terms she'd never heard him use. Calculations that spoke of hidden knowledge. Here, Gideon pointed to a series of marks beneath their property. Silver deposits. Your husband marked them here, here, and here. The world tilted around Eliza. Silver? According to these maps, you're sitting on one of the largest silver veins in the territory. Gideon's voice carried wonder and concern in equal measure. This deposit extends under half the town. Eliza stared at the maps spread across the barn floor. Thomas hadn't been a dreamer. He'd been a trained geologist who discovered a fortune beneath their feet. Her mind raced through memories. His excitement in those final weeks. His secretive trips to the barn. His sudden death, just as he'd seemed ready to share something important. Why didn't he tell me? Maybe he tried. Gideon gathered more papers from a wooden box. Look at this. Legal documents filled with Thomas's handwriting. Preliminary mining claim forms, partially completed but never filed. Notes about territorial law and mineral rights. A half-written letter addressed to the territorial governor. He was preparing to file official claims, Gideon explained, but something stopped him. Something. Or someone. Eliza remembered Thomas's final weeks, his growing nervousness, the way he'd watched the road as if expecting unwelcome visitors. Marcus Whitmore's increased interest in buying their land. Gideon. Her voice came out as a whisper. What if Thomas didn't die naturally? The question hung between them like smoke. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn walls. The maps spread across the dirt floor represented millions of dollars in silver ore. Enough wealth to kill for. We need to be very careful, Gideon said finally. You believe me? I've seen what men do for far less money. His expression hardened. In my railroad days, I watched surveyors disappear when they found valuable deposits on the wrong man's land. Eliza gathered the maps with shaking hands. What do we do? First, we secure these documents. Second, we research the legal requirements for filing claims. Gideon helped her stack the papers carefully. Third, we tell no one until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. Marcus Whitmore has been pressuring me to sell. How long? Since Thomas died. He says the land's worthless. The irony tasted bitter. He offers just enough to keep me from starving. Gideon's jaw tightened. Men like Whitmore don't waste time on worthless land. They spent the remaining daylight hours studying Thomas's geological notes. Eliza discovered her husband had taught himself advanced surveying techniques through correspondence courses. His samples and measurements revealed silver deposits worth more money than she could comprehend. As evening approached, they hid the documents in a waterproof pouch beneath loose floorboards. The secret felt heavy as a stone in Eliza's chest. "There's something else," Gideon said, as they secured the hiding place. "These maps show a 60-day filing deadline from the date of discovery. Your husband noted the discovery date as 2 years ago, the week before he died, which means his claims expired long ago. But if we can prove his original discovery and demonstrate continuous possession of the land, we might be able to refile." Hope flickered in Eliza's chest for the first time in months. Not hope for mere survival, but for justice, for Thomas's vindication, for a future beyond poverty and whispered curses. Outside, night fell across Elmsworth. In the darkness, Rebecca Salter's house glowed with lamplight as neighbors gathered to share the latest gossip about the widow and her giant protector. They had no idea that the cursed woman now held the power to reshape their entire world. 3 days passed in careful secrecy. Eliza and Gideon spent their evenings studying territorial mining laws by candlelight while the town slept. During daylight hours, Eliza moved through Elmsworth like a ghost, listening to conversations that people assumed she couldn't hear. Her invisible status had always been a curse. Now it became her greatest advantage. At the general store, she overheard Marcus Whitmore discussing land purchases with Mayor Harrison. Whitmore had been systematically buying properties around her homestead for the past 18 months, always at prices far below market value, always from families facing sudden financial difficulties. The Patterson farm, sold after their barn burned down mysteriously. The Williamson plot, purchased when their well went dry overnight. The Henderson property, bought cheap when their livestock died from poisoned water. Eliza remembered each incident. Accidents, everyone had said. Bad luck that struck Elmsworth's outlying families one by one. At the barber shop, she learned that Whitmore had received visitors from the territorial capital. Well-dressed men who spoke in hushed tones about development opportunities and government contracts. Men who left town the same day each family faced their convenient disasters. By the 4th evening, Eliza had mapped out a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond one greedy banker. "Look at this." She spread her notes across Thomas's desk while Gideon studied the original survey maps. Every property Whitmore bought sits directly over the silver vein. Gideon traced the mineral deposits with his finger. "He knew about the silver before your husband died. Which means someone else discovered it first. Someone who shared the information with Whitmore instead of filing proper claims. Or someone killed your husband before he could file." The words hung heavy between them. Eliza had suspected murder for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach clench. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Eliza quickly covered the maps while Gideon moved toward the window. Sheriff Archer's familiar silhouette stood on her porch. "Evening, Mrs. Montgomery." Archer removed his hat as she opened the door. "Mind if we talk?" Eliza glanced back at Gideon, who nodded slightly. "Come in, Sheriff." Archer stepped inside and surveyed the cabin with careful eyes. His gaze lingered on Thomas's desk, the geological books, the subtle signs of recent activity. "Here you've got yourself a boarder. Mr. Braxton rents my barn space." "That all he's doing here?" Eliza bristled. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing improper." Archer's tone softened. "Just concerned for your safety. This town has a long memory for tragedy." Gideon emerged from the shadows near the window. Archer's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, then stopped when he saw Gideon's relaxed posture. "Sheriff," Gideon said quietly. "Mr. Braxton." Archer studied the giant man with professional interest. "You planning to stay in Elmsworth long?" "Depends." "On what?" "Whether Mrs. Montgomery needs my help." Something shifted in Archer's expression. Not suspicion, but understanding. He looked between Eliza and Gideon as if weighing a difficult decision. "There's something you both should know." Archer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "About the men who courted Mrs. Montgomery before." Eliza's breath caught. "What about them?" "James Miller didn't die in that hunting accident. Someone put a bullet in his back and staged the scene." Archer's weathered face showed the weight of carrying this secret. "Samuel Reed didn't drown in the river. He had a head wound that came before he hit the water." "And Henry Walsh?" Eliza's voice came out strangled. "Disappeared completely. Found his horse with blood on the saddle 20 miles east of town." Archer met her eyes directly. "I've been investigating these deaths for 2 years. Every trail leads back to the same conclusion." "Which is?" "Someone's been killing any man who gets close to you, Mrs. Montgomery. Someone who wants you isolated and vulnerable." Gideon stepped closer to Eliza. "Why haven't you made arrests?" "No evidence that would stand up in territorial court. The killer's smart, professional." Archer's jaw tightened. "But I know who's behind it." The cabin fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. Eliza's mind raced through the implications. 3 good men dead because they'd shown her kindness. 3 murders disguised as accidents. "Marcus Whitmore." She said the name like a curse. Archer nodded grimly. "Can't prove it, but every death happened right after Whitmore made you another offer to sell your land." "Why tell us this now?" Gideon asked. "Because you're still breathing after a week in this town. Either you're luckier than the others, or something's changed." Archer studied them both carefully. "I'm hoping it's the second option." Eliza looked at the covered maps on Thomas's desk. Sheriff Archer had spent 2 years trying to protect her from a killer. He deserved to know the truth. "Sheriff, what would you say if I told you my land was worth more than anyone imagined?" Archer's eyes sharpened. "I'd say that would explain a lot of mysterious deaths. And if I said there was evidence of a conspiracy involving territorial officials, I'd say we better be very careful who we trust." Gideon uncovered the geological surveys. "Then you should see these." For the next hour they laid out everything. Thomas's geological expertise, the silver deposits worth millions, the systematic land grabbing, the pattern of convenient accidents. Archer studied each document with growing amazement and anger. This conspiracy reaches all the way to the territorial governor's office. "Can you help us?" Eliza asked. "I can try to keep you alive long enough to file proper claims. But we're up against powerful men with government connections." Archer refolded the maps carefully. "We'll need federal help to take down something this big." Outside, a horse rode past at unusual speed for the late hour. All 3 of them moved toward the windows. In the darkness, they couldn't identify the rider, but his urgency suggested trouble. "Someone knows we're talking," Gideon said quietly. Archer checked his gun and moved toward the door. "From now on, assume you're being watched every moment. Trust no one except each other." As the sheriff disappeared into the night, Eliza realized their small alliance had become something larger, not just a fight for her inheritance, but a battle against corruption that had poisoned the entire territory. The stakes had grown beyond her wildest fears. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Elmsworth's annual Founders' Day celebration would take place in 2 weeks. Territorial Governor Phillips would attend, along with various officials from the capital. The entire town buzzed with preparations for the biggest event of the year. Eliza watched from her kitchen window as banners went up across Main Street. For the first time in months, she saw opportunity instead of isolation. Perfect timing, Gideon said as he entered with fresh eggs from the henhouse he'd repaired. Territorial officials in one place, federal marshals providing security. You think they'll listen to us? They'll have to once they see the evidence. Over breakfast, they planned their strategy. Present the geological surveys publicly during the governor's speech. Expose the conspiracy in front of witnesses who couldn't be silenced or bought. Force a federal investigation before Whitmore could eliminate them. But first, they needed to build an airtight case. Eliza spent the morning in the church basement, researching territorial records that Pastor Williams had preserved in his unofficial archives. Most people ignored the elderly preacher's obsession with local history. Eliza found his meticulous documentation invaluable. She discovered that Marcus Whitmore had arrived in Elmsworth 3 years ago with credentials from a territorial development company. His backing came from investors in the capital who specialized in mineral extraction. Men who had somehow known about silver deposits before any official surveys were conducted. The conspiracy reached deeper than they'd imagined. Meanwhile, Gideon rode to the telegraph office in the next town over, using his railroad contacts to verify land ownership records. His old supervisor now worked for the Federal Land Office, a man who owed Gideon favors and could ensure their mining claims received proper attention. When he returned that evening, his news was both encouraging and terrifying. My contact confirmed it. The Territorial Development Company is a front for Governor Phillips and his business partners. They've been stealing mineral-rich land across 6 counties using the same methods. Eliza set down her sewing with trembling hands. How many families? Dozens, maybe more. Gideon's face was grim. They've perfected the system. Local banker identifies valuable land, creates financial pressure on owners, then buys properties for nothing. Anyone who resists faces accidents or mysterious deaths. What about federal oversight? That's our advantage. Washington has been investigating territorial corruption for months. They're looking for witnesses willing to testify. Hope flickered in Eliza's chest. Justice seemed possible for the first time since Thomas's death. Their planning was interrupted by urgent knocking. Sheriff Archer entered without waiting for permission, his face tight with worry. We have a problem. Someone broke into the land office last night, tried to destroy property records. Eliza's blood ran cold. Did they succeed? No. But whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. They went straight for the mineral survey files. The message was clear. Whitmore knew they were building a case against him. It gets worse, Archer continued. I found evidence that someone's been watching this cabin. Boot prints near your windows. Cigarette butts that didn't come from either of you. Gideon moved to check the window latches. How long? At least a week. Maybe since I first visited. The cabin suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. Eliza realized they'd been living under surveillance while believing themselves safe. There's more. Archer hesitated. Rebecca Salter came to see me today. Someone offered her money for information about your daily routines, about who visits and when. Did she take it? She did. But then she got scared and came to confess. Archer's expression softened slightly. Seems she's finally realized her gossip might get people killed. A strange development. The town's biggest gossip developing a conscience just when they needed allies most. That night, they moved their meeting to the abandoned schoolhouse on the town's edge. Too risky to keep gathering at Eliza's cabin with watchers in the shadows. By lamplight, they compiled their final evidence. Thomas's geological surveys, legal documentation of Whitmore's systematic land purchases, testimony about the mysterious deaths, federal contacts willing to intervene. We have enough to destroy the entire conspiracy, Eliza said as she organized the papers into a leather satchel. If we live long enough to present it, Gideon added grimly. Archer had brought disturbing news from his own investigation. 3 new strangers arrived in town today, professional types who don't fit the usual cowboy or merchant categories. They're staying at Whitmore's private rooms above the bank. Hired guns. The conspiracy was preparing to eliminate loose ends before Founders Day arrived. We need protection, Eliza said. Already arranged. Gideon pulled out a telegram from his railroad contact. Federal marshals will arrive tomorrow, supposedly for routine security. But they'll be watching for signs of trouble. What if Whitmore moves against us before then? Then we make our stand here. Archer checked his rifle. But I don't think he'll risk open violence with the governor coming. Too much attention. They spent the remaining hours creating multiple copies of their evidence, hidden in different locations around town, cached with trusted allies, sent by telegraph to federal offices in distant cities. If something happened to them, the truth would survive. As dawn approached, Eliza felt the weight of approaching confrontation. 2 weeks of careful planning had led to this moment. Either they would expose the conspiracy and claim justice for Thomas's murder, or they would join the long list of victims who'd stood in Whitmore's way. Outside the schoolhouse, a horse whinnied in the distance. Someone was watching even here. The final game had begun, and the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. In 6 days, Governor Phillips would arrive for Founders Day. 6 days to stay alive and protect their evidence. 6 days to transform from victims into the instruments of justice that would reshape the entire territory. The countdown had started, and there was no turning back. Founders Day morning dawned bright and clear across Elmsworth. Colorful banners stretched between buildings, while the smell of roasting meat filled the air. The entire town had gathered in the central square, dressed in their finest clothes for Governor Phillips' arrival. Eliza stood at her cabin window, watching the festivities from a distance. For 2 years, she'd been excluded from community celebrations. Today, she would become their center of attention in ways none of them expected. Her hands trembled as she fastened Thomas's silver locket around her neck. Inside was his photograph and a small piece of silver ore from his geological samples, a reminder of why she fought. Ready? Gideon appeared in the doorway, wearing his only clean shirt and a borrowed tie. Eliza nodded and reached for the black veil she'd worn every day since Thomas's death. Then she stopped. Today marked the end of mourning and the beginning of justice. She left the veil on the kitchen table. They walked toward town together, the leather satchel of evidence secure in Gideon's large hands. Federal marshals had positioned themselves discreetly throughout the crowd, looking like ordinary celebration attendees. Sheriff Archer stood near the speaking platform, his badge catching the morning sunlight. The governor's carriage arrived precisely at noon. Philip stepped out to enthusiastic applause from the gathered crowd. He was younger than Eliza had expected, with smooth features and expensive clothes that marked him as a man comfortable with power. Marcus Whitmore hurried forward to greet the governor personally. Their brief conversation appeared cordial, but Eliza noticed the tension in Whitmore's shoulders. He knew something was wrong. Citizens of Elmsworth, Governor Phillips began his speech from the decorated platform. Today we celebrate the pioneering spirit that built this great territory. The crowd cheered. Children waved small flags while their parents pressed closer to hear every word. This was the moment they'd planned for. Maximum visibility with witnesses who couldn't be silenced. Our territory grows stronger each year through the hard work and determination of families who believe in progress. Eliza stepped forward from the crowd's edge. Her movement caught several people's attention, including Rebecca Salter, who whispered urgently to her neighbors. The cursed widow was approaching the governor's platform. We celebrate those who transform wilderness into prosperity through honest labor and fair dealing. More heads turned as Eliza continued walking. Gideon flanked her right side while Sheriff Archer moved closer to the platform's left edge. The federal marshals tensed, ready to act. Governor Phillips paused mid-sentence as he noticed the commotion. His eyes found Eliza in the crowd, then shifted to Whitmore, whose face had gone pale. "However," Eliza called out in a clear, carrying voice, "some prosperity comes through murder and theft." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Governor Phillips stepped back from the podium, clearly unprepared for public confrontation. Whitmore pushed through the assembled townspeople toward Eliza. "Mrs. Montgomery, you're clearly distraught," Whitmore said loudly. "Perhaps you should return home." "I am home." Eliza reached the platform's base. "Standing on land that belongs to me and contains resources worth millions of dollars." The murmurs grew louder. Mayor Harrison tried to restore order while Whitmore's hired men moved through the crowd. But federal marshals blocked their approach with subtle positioning. "Governor Phillips," Eliza continued, "I have evidence of systematic corruption in your territorial development program. Evidence of murder, land fraud, and conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of government." Phillips recovered his composure quickly. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Montgomery, with serious evidence to support it." Gideon stepped forward and opened the leather satchel. Geological surveys, legal documents, witness testimony, financial records. He handed the first document to Governor Phillips. Thomas's professional geological survey showing massive silver deposits beneath Elmsworth. Phillips studied the technical drawings with obvious recognition. "These surveys were completed 3 years ago," Eliza announced to the crowd, "by my late husband, a trained geologist who discovered enough silver to make every family in this town wealthy." Excited whispers rippled through the assembly. Silver meant jobs, prosperity, hope for the future. Unfortunately, Eliza's voice carried across the square, certain territorial officials decided to steal these resources rather than develop them legally. She pointed directly at Whitmore. "Marcus Whitmore murdered my husband to prevent him from filing proper mining claims. He then systematically killed or drove away any man who might discover the truth." The crowd's mood shifted from excitement to horror. These weren't abstract accusations, but personal betrayals affecting their own community. "She's lying," Whitmore shouted, "a desperate widow making wild claims." "Then explain this." Sheriff Archer produced a second document. Financial records showing payments from territorial development funds to known criminals. Payments that coincide exactly with mysterious deaths and convenient accidents. Governor Phillips examined the records with growing alarm. Either he was genuinely surprised by the corruption, or he was an excellent actor. "And this," Gideon presented the final piece of evidence. "Correspondence between Marcus Whitmore and territorial officials planning to divide the stolen mineral rights among private investors." The letters bore official territorial seals and signatures, undeniable proof of conspiracy at the highest levels. Whitmore made one last desperate attempt to control the situation. "You can't trust the word of a cursed woman who's already killed 3 men. "I killed no one," Eliza replied firmly. "But you murdered James Miller, Samuel Reed, Henry Walsh, and my husband, Thomas Montgomery. You stole their lives to steal our land." The crowd pressed closer, their initial shock transforming into anger. These men had been their neighbors, their friends. Someone would pay for their deaths. Governor Phillips raised his hand for silence. "Federal marshals will investigate these allegations immediately. Mr. Whitmore, you're under arrest pending a full inquiry." The marshals moved swiftly to surround Whitmore and his hired men. No violence, no dramatic shootout, just the quiet efficiency of justice finally served. As handcuffs clicked around Whitmore's wrists, he looked directly at Eliza with undisguised hatred. "You have no idea what you've started." "I know exactly what I've finished," she replied. The cursed widow of Elmsworth had just become its savior. 6 months later, Elmsworth bore little resemblance to the dusty frontier town that had once whispered curses about the lonely Black Widow. The main street bustled with activity as silver mine workers finished their shifts and merchants counted profits from the most prosperous season in the territory's history. Eliza stood on the porch of her expanded home, watching wagons loaded with silver ore roll toward the new railway depot. The federal investigation had moved swiftly after Founders' Day. Governor Phillips, surprisingly, had proven innocent of direct involvement and had cooperated fully in exposing the conspiracy. Marcus Whitmore now served 20 years in territorial prison along with 6 accomplices. The silver deposits had exceeded even Thomas's optimistic projections. Eliza's mining operation employed half the town at wages that allowed families to buy their own land and build substantial homes. She'd kept her promise to share the prosperity with the community that had eventually embraced her. The afternoon shift reports are ready. Rebecca Salter approached with a stack of papers, her manner respectful and professional. The former gossip now managed Eliza's administrative office with surprising competence. "Any problems with the new equipment?" "None. Production is ahead of schedule for the 3rd consecutive month." Rebecca's transformation had been the most surprising development of all. After witnessing Whitmore's arrest, she'd spent weeks apologizing to every person she'd wronged with her rumors. Eliza had been the first to offer her redemption through honest work. "Mrs. Braxton." Rebecca still struggled with the new name. "There's a delegation from Silver Creek requesting a meeting. They believe their land might contain similar deposits." Eliza nodded. Word of Elmsworth's prosperity had spread throughout the territory. Towns that had suffered under similar corruption schemes now sought her expertise in reclaiming their stolen resources. "Schedule them for Thursday. Make sure Sheriff Archer attends." Clayton Archer had become the territorial marshal for the entire mining district. His investigation skills and unshakable integrity made him invaluable in rooting out remaining corruption. 3 more conspiracies had been exposed using his methods and Eliza's legal strategies. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road. Gideon rode toward the house accompanied by a group of surveyors and federal engineers. His work now involved mapping mineral deposits across the entire territory while ensuring fair development policies. "How did the northern survey go?" Eliza asked as he dismounted. "Better than expected. We found copper and possibly gold in the hills beyond Miller's Creek." They walked together toward the house they'd built, where her small cabin once stood. Large enough for the family they planned, but not ostentatious like the mansions some mining barons favored. Comfort without excess reflected their shared values. "There's news from the Capitol," Gideon continued. "The federal mining reform bill passed Congress. Our testimony helped establish new protections for small landowners." Eliza smiled. Their victory in Elmsworth had contributed to changes affecting the entire nation. No longer could territorial officials steal land through manufactured emergencies and convenient deaths. Inside their home, dinner waited on the mahogany table Thomas had built during their early marriage. Eliza had kept his furniture and books as reminders of the dreams that eventually came true. His geological instruments now occupied a place of honor in their study. Rebecca mentioned visitors from Silver Creek, Gideon said as they sat down to eat. Another town that suffered under the development company scheme. They want help exposing local corruption. Are we ready to take on another fight? Eliza considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to focus on Elmsworth and enjoy their hard-won peace, but dozens of families across the territory still suffered under systems they now had the power to challenge. Thomas always said, "Justice delayed is justice denied." Then we help them. After dinner, they walked through the town center where new businesses thrived under the warm glow of electric streetlights. The Silver Moon Saloon had been replaced by a library and community center. The old general store had expanded into a proper mercantile that served 3 counties. Most importantly, children played in the streets without fear. Families gathered on their porches in the evening air. Elmsworth had become the kind of place people wanted to build their lives rather than escape from. "Do you ever regret it?" Gideon asked as they paused near the new church. "The quiet life we might have had?" Eliza looked back toward their house, then at the prosperous town spreading around them. "I regret that Thomas didn't live to see it, but I wouldn't change anything else." They stopped at Thomas's grave in the hillside cemetery. Eliza had commissioned a proper headstone that identified him as the geologist and visionary who'd made Elmsworth's prosperity possible. Fresh flowers adorned the grave, left by townspeople who now understood his contribution. "He'd be proud," Gideon said quietly. "He'd be amazed. Thomas always believed in the silver deposits, but I don't think he imagined this level of transformation." Above them, stars appeared in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over Eliza during her loneliest nights as the cursed widow. Now they illuminated a future full of purpose and possibility. As they walked home hand in hand, Eliza reflected on the journey from isolation to influence. The town that had once whispered about her curse now looked to her for leadership. The woman they'd expected to fade away had instead become the architect of their salvation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more towns to help, more corruption to expose, more families to lift from poverty to prosperity. But tonight, Elmsworth rested peacefully under the protection of justice and the promise of continued growth. The lonely Black Widow had become a powerful force for change, and her story was just beginning.